Okay, welcome YouTube. This is my officially second YouTube video, and this is something that's come around with some discussions with Mr. Stephen Brown. And for those of you who are into fountain pens, you're probably well aware of Mr. Stephen Brown's channel. He does a lot of pen reviews. He is the man behind the encyclopedia entries for the Fountain Pen Network. And one of the things that he does with the encyclopedia entries, for those of you, again, who are familiar, is he will show you an ink actually working. Now, that comes in a variety of different methods. He will show you a sample writing from a number of different pens. A fine point, a medium point, a broad nib, and also a flex nib. He then goes on to show you a couple of tests. He does something called the Tardif test, where he takes a small knife and smears some ink on the page, giving you some impression of how the ink shades. He shows you some very fat writing using a very broad, I believe it's a Pilot 6mm parallel calligraphy pen, which shows you again shading, but also some more of the properties of the flow of the ink and how well it lays down a very broad line on the page. He also does some waterproof tests, and this is the reason behind my video today. His waterproof tests often include just an eyedropper. He calls it the eyedropper of death, where he will dribble some water onto the paper and demonstrate in some way how waterproof or water fast the ink could be. And the other test that he does is something called the bastard brush test, where he'll take a small brush and just run that over the writing, just to smear that around with some water again. Now, there are many bulletproof inks out there, allegedly bulletproof, which really just means that they have some kind of a permanent quality to them. They are light fast, maybe they're waterproof, maybe they're fade resistant, maybe they're archival quality, so they have very low levels of acid in the ink or strong alkalis. So they won't necessarily degrade the paper that they've been written onto. Well, I only have one ink in my collection that would meet such criteria, and that's the Pelikan Fount India. It is an Indian ink designed specifically for fountain pens. Unfortunately, I don't have the bottle anymore. It has been decanted into some small ink vials. Just showing you that here. The bottle actually came in an eyedropper format, so it looked like the kind of bottle you would have eyedrops in. So you would just drip them. And this is great for filling things like drawing pens, or if you just want to squeeze it out into a ink bottle or a small ink dish. Unfortunately, it makes filling fountain pens very difficult, especially where you have a vacuum filling pen or you have a pen using a converter system of some sort. So what I did was I decanted the Pelikan Fount India into these little ink vials. I originally actually had them in my TWSBI Diamond ink bottle, which I have here. This was for my TWSBI Diamond 580. Unfortunately, the ink had the unfortunate habit of staining the inside of the bottle. I'm holding this a little closer to the camera. I don't know if that's going to focus, but you can see there the breather hole for the ink bottle, and you can see that dark smudge there is the staining caused by the ink. The inside of the bottle has discolored a little bit, but not too badly, and a little bit of bleach diluted in water did actually get the bottle back up looking, well, maybe not quite as new, but certainly good, looking clean again. Now, the ink was stored in there, and one of the properties of the ink is that it's supposed to be a pigmented ink, or an Indian style ink, but formulated for fountain pens. What I noticed when I had it in the bottle is where you would kind of shake the bottle up and the ink would slowly settle, leaving a thin film on the inside of the bottle. It would shade the inside of the bottle. Again, apologies that I can't show you this, but I did want this bottle clean for another use. But it would leave little particles tiny, tiny little particles. It looks almost like a powder suspended in the liquid, which essentially, I suppose, is what Indian ink is. A dye-based or a powder-based ink that's suspended in some form of chemicals or solvents and also water to make it soluble for a pen. Well, Pelikan claim that that ink is suitable for fountain pens. They also claim that it has permanent qualities and that the ink is essentially bulletproof. Oh, actually no, I tell a lie. They don't specifically claim that it is a bulletproof ink. However, it is described as a permanent ink. It is described as having all the properties of India ink, and one of those is permanency and waterproofness. So I decided that we're going to put that to the test. I want to see if this ink could indeed be bulletproof. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little writing sample using this Pelikan Fount India. As you can see, I've not got much left. I do need to order some more of this ink. And we're going to put it through its paces. And I've devised a couple of tests that we're going to conduct on this ink. The first of which is going to be the obligatory water drop test. So I've got an ink syringe. I unfortunately don't have a pipette or an eyedropper, but I've got an ink syringe, and I'm just going to use that to dribble or drop ink, water onto the ink to see how waterproof that ink's going to be. The second test is I'm going to use one of those ink eraser pens. Now, some of you may have used these in the past. They are great for children getting into fountain pens for the first time, and they really only designed to work on washable blue ink. Lamy make these. You can buy I believe the Tiger brand from China, which is what I have. If I can just dig around in my drawer for a moment, I'll see if I can find you one to show you. Here we go. So for those of you that have not seen these before, it is I suppose it is a chemical kind of eraser. You have this thick white end, which is what will wipe away the ink, and effectively the pigment in the ink is dissolved by whatever chemical this uses. And then at the other end you have a blue fine liner, so you can rewrite what you've erased. Because obviously if you go over it with your fountain pen again, it's just going to disappear all over. So that's going to be the second test. We're going to test it with this. I really don't think it's going to pass the test, but we're going to test it nonetheless. This is one of the Tiger brand from China. As I said, Lamy make one. That's probably the most common one you'll find, but these were cheap on eBay. The third test I'm going to do is again going to be using my ink syringe. This is a ink syringe. This is not a pointed tip. And I'm going to use a very mildly diluted bleach solution. Now bleach, obviously you do have to be careful when you're using bleach, but I'm going to dissolve a small amount of bleach in some water, and I'm going to drip that onto the writing sample. And I want to see how well the ink holds up against this bleach. And then finally, maybe there'll be some other tests that I can think of, but really these are the three main ones. To test the waterproofness, and in the case of the bleach, to test the light fastness or the strength of the pigment in the ink. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and for the test today I'm using my Waterman Filius. This is actually the first fountain pen that I bought for myself. My very, very first fountain pen was actually a Parker Duofold Junior. That was a pen given to me by my grandmother. It belonged to my aunt, and she used it when she was a very young child at school. And she passed away many years ago, many years before I was born, so unfortunately I never knew her. But I do have her pen. Now the pen is not in great condition. It was, well, a 12-year-old me that just tried to fix it. Left it in a slightly worse condition than I was given it to. But it was a pen that had sat in a drawer for a very long time. Ink had crusted in it, the feed was all clogged up. And I did my best to clean the pen up and get it working, and it does indeed work. But I do not want to subject that pen to any kind of a permanent ink. The second pen that I bought myself, this was the first pair, I think I was about 15 or so, and I decided that I wanted something a little bit newer. I wanted to use fountain pens more. I'd had the obligatory Parker Vectors, and they got lost over the years. But this was the first fountain pen that I purchased that used a cartridge converting system. So this is the Waterman converter. The pen is already inked up. There's you won't be able to see it because I haven't filled the converter, but there is ink actually in there. That's the Pelikan Fount India that we're going to be using. But this was the first pen that I bought for myself. I can't remember how much I paid for this. It would maybe 15 or 20 pounds a good 20 years ago. And this pen's not had a huge amount of use. It's been kept in a drawer. It's not exactly my preferred style of pen. The marbling is very attractive. You've got the gold bands, you've got the gold clip. The clip is spring loaded, so you can feel that there is some movement in there. But I find that purple and gold, albeit my younger self may have appealed to, it's not the kind of pen that I would carry around. However, it does have a absolutely gorgeous nib. Now, Waterman classed this as a medium nib. However, it writes more akin to a broad. And of recent, the only ink that has been used in this pen is the Jehabal Rouge Hematite, the limited edition ink, which is a beautifully shaded ink. A deep, deep red, not a blood red, I wouldn't say. It has a pinker, more red and more vibrant colour to it, but it has a gold sheen. And unfortunately the ink has a habit of staining almost everything it touches. So the feed often ends up with a slightly gold-green sheen to it. No matter how hard you scrub, it takes a while to get the dried ink off the nib. But this is the only broad-ish nib that I have, and I did want to put this ink fully to the test. And to properly do a waterproof test or a saturation test, I did want to do this with a broad nib. Personally, I tend to write with a fine or a skinny medium, so to speak. So, for the test, we're going to do a number of writing samples, and I'm just going to repeat the same text over. So, for the test, we're going to do a number of writing samples, each of which is going to be subjected to a slightly different test. As I said, the water drop or the eye drop test, the ink eraser test, and also the bleach test, and whatever else I can come up with. So this is the pen that I'm going to use for the test today. This, as I mentioned, this has already been inked up. And for my paper, unfortunately, I don't have any Clairefontaine or Rhodia paper to do the test on. So instead, this is just a reasonably good quality plain writing paper. It takes ink rather well. I do use it for writing letters with reasonably heavy weight. So let's begin. So we have a Pelikan Fount India, and this is our Bulletproof ink test. You can see I've got a few flow issues in the pen. So this pen has been used almost exclusively with Rouge Hematite, so there's probably all kinds of stuff gummed up in there, and I've not really tried to remove this nib and feed for fear of damaging the pen. So perhaps this needs a better flush than I thought. But we will carry on and see if the pen will at least write for me today. So, in honour of Mr. Stephen Brown, I'm going to continue with the quick brown fox. Jumping over the lazy Pelikan. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sample, as I said, and each of these writing samples is going to have a slightly different test subjected to it. Okay, so let us give these a little bit of a title. So this top one I'm going to call the straight waterproof test. And this is going to be using the eyedropper, well, I suppose the ink syringe. So that's going to be the first test we're going to run. The second test we are going to run is going to be using the ink eraser. So that is ink eraser test. And then the third test that we're going to do is going to be the dilute bleach solution test. And then I'll do one final bit of text just in case I come up with any other tests that we could run. Sorry, my apologies here. So we'll call this the unknown test just in case I think of anything else. So the quick brown fox jumps okay. Okay, so we are back. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do our waterproofness test. So I have a jam jar here filled with water. I normally use this for cleaning my pens. So I'm going to draw a little water up with the ink syringe. Just recap that.
The world was on fire and no one can save me but you. This strange what desire.
So I'm going to leave that to sit for a few minutes while we move on to our ink eraser test. So the white end is the erase end, and I really don't have much hopes for this, but we'll give it a go anyway. Well, that's interesting. It is not, so to speak, erasing the ink, but it's doing a very good job of smudging it all over the page. Quite. I probably should have demonstrated how this actually does work when you use some erasable ink. Let me just see if I can find one of my pens that may be filled. So I have here the ink formerly known as Florida Blue or Waterman Tifcaf, and this is a vintage Parker 17 Lady with a cursive nib. Just recap that. So this is purely to demonstrate how this ink eraser would normally work. As you can see, it's not really done much apart from smeared the ink. So normally if you were using this, you'd write something, give that a second to dry, and then use the ink eraser. As if by magic that would all but disappear. You might be able to see there is a very slight trace of the text there, and then switching to the other end you would then rewrite over the top of this or whatever you should have written before, and just my luck, this is running dry. But that's how it should work, and clearly it hasn't. So let us move on to the dilute bleach test. Now I filled a small glass here with some bleach solution. You can see it's quite cloudy there from the bleach. And again, I'm going to use my ink syringe. Now, I'm not wearing gloves or any kind of safety protective equipment because A, you wouldn't be able to hear me, and B, if I was, I wouldn't be able to see what I'm doing. So we're going to do a quick test with the bleach. And again, just as I did with the ink drops, I'm going to just dribble this onto the ink, onto the writing sample, and see if this has any kind of effect on the text. Okay, we'll leave that to sit for a while. So coming back to the original waterproof test, we've got a lot of water still there on the page, so I'm just going to blot that off before it soaks too deeply into the paper. I don't want to ruin the entire pad, and with hindsight I probably should have put a sheet of plastic underneath this to stop it soaking through. But that has been sat there for a good few minutes. You can see a small amount of ink has come away on the tissue. But all in all, I think this is a pretty good result here. We can see that although the paper is buckled under the water, I've got the tiniest little bit of feathering, a very slight amount of shading, or a loss of colour, but I can see no bleeding. I can see no smudging. I can see everything is still as it should be. So this would be completely and utterly legible, even in the grid text, even in the skinniest of lines there where my pen railroaded slightly. Completely legible, indeed completely waterproof. We can also see that it has survived the ink eraser test. That was amusing, to say the least. And now let us see if the bleach solution has done anything. And to be honest, I don't think it has. We can see a little bit of ink bleeding into the water, the very tiniest amounts. But let us soak this up. So this hasn't had quite as long as the original water test did, but I think it's just as conclusive. Got a little bit more staining on the tissue there. Just move that into shot. So you can see that it has lifted some of the ink away, but all in all I think very, very little. So what can we see here? Again, a very small amount of feathering where the water has saturated the page. We've got a little bit of greying in the ink. It's not as jet black as it was, but no bleeding, no spreading. So that is the conclusion, really, that this Pelikan Fount India ink is indeed extremely water resistant, bleach resistant, and as far as fountain pen off-the-shelf products goes, reasonably chemical resistant. So the next thing to do is to do a final scorecard. So again, in honour of Mr. Stephen Brown, we're going to use the Encyclopedia scoring system. So, starting with cleaning. This is not a particularly difficult ink to clean out of pens. I've not used it in any vintage pens, I've not used it in anything overly valuable, but it will flush out very, very quickly as long as you don't let the ink dry inside the pen. I've not yet had any problems with pens gumming up with this ink, but as you saw at the very beginning of the test, there were a few flow problems with this pen. But cleaning, generally, I'm going to give that a 2. What about bleed through? Well, I'm not doing a plain copy paper test, so we're just going to evaluate how it's performed on this paper. And, well, even underwater, not under water, but under the influence of water, we can see that the ink has not bled at all. We have shade through. You can probably see that in all the writing samples. but there is no bleed through whatsoever. So I'm going to give that full marks, 3. Colour? Well, it's black. Shading. Well, shading is the reason I bought this ink in the first place, because I wanted the blackest of inks, and this is indeed a solid black. The only time you'll ever find shading in this ink is if you have a problem with flow or you have a problem with your pen. This will always give you a solid black line with no variation. You may as well be writing with a fiber tip or a felt tip pen. So for shading, it's going to get a 1 because there is virtually no shading whatsoever, and that's a good thing, certainly for me purchasing this ink. Flow. Well, you saw me having a few startup issues with the pen originally. By and large, I have no issues with flow with this ink. If anything, I have nib creep, where you start seeing ink creeping onto the tines of the nib. So flow I would consider to be excellent. I'm going to give that a 3. If anything, it might be too good. So we're going to give that a 3. Feathering. Well, as Mr. Brown will always say, this is a property of the ink as well as a property of the paper. But even on this relatively cheap writing pad, I have no feathering whatsoever. I've used this on cheap standard copier paper that I stole out of my printer, and again I've never had any issues with feathering. So again, I'm going to give that full marks. Drying time. Well, that was 5 seconds. I would say that's reasonably good. About 20 seconds ago I wrote feathering, nothing at all. So I'm going to give that 2. And waterproofness. Well, top marks, don't you think? 3 points for waterproofness. And our final assessment will be bulletproofness. And that's going to be something a little bit harder to quantify. So, not bulletproof. 0. Which gives us a total inkage of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Take care.
Ah, I've got some bluebills over there.
So, bulletproof ink test. We've done our writing sample. As mentioned, my pointing implement. We've done our water drop test. The ink has survived that beautifully. We have done our ink eraser test, our chemical test. It has also survived that beautifully. And we've done our dilute bleach test, and lo and behold, it has survived that as well. So, our final test, let's see if it's actually bulletproof. Stand down the road. And we'll take a couple of shots. I think that is indeed a successful bulletproof ink test. Would you concur, Pat? Yeah. So, I think we can officially say that Pelikan Fount India is not bulletproof.